Hi everybody, good morning. I came to know yesterday that my name's meaning in Spanish is not very good, but I told the driver, the one who was bringing me in the cab, that I come from Pakistan, so my name's meaning is different. So here I am. I am going to present, the title of my presentation is Borderland of Kashmir and the Question of Environmental Justice, Curfew Night by Rabia Aamir. Spivak says, and I quote, Freud calls repudiation an unusually strong defense mechanism. Kashmir, also called South Asia's Palestine, it is largely studied in the context of Indian-Pakistani conflict. While this context holds its own importance, shifting some frames of reference, I examine the issue of Kashmir from a Kashmiri writer's perspective. Being from an ongoing study, this part of the paper is ethnographic in nature. It provides the historical and political background to an eco-post-colonial reading of my selected text by Rabia Aamir, an Anglophonic South Asian writer from Kashmir. I argue that justice post-colonial studies has emerged from its borderland status and eventually established its validity against the pervasive universalist Eurocentric claims. The literature from Borderland of Kashmir, as I read it, coming from one of the highest military zones in the world, is extending the capacity for post-colonial appraisal with an attention to social justice and the debates of environmental ethics, like many other borderlands already studied in these dimensions. Interviewing his personal trajectory with the national authoritarianism that has emerged in recent times, Peer traces the lived-in experiences of his childhood, adolescence, and a part of his adult life in his memoir and discusses the militant nationalism not only in terms of different Kashmiri factions, but also in the form of belligerent Indian nationalism. I propose that from the marginal space of Kashmir, his work is a timely categorizes, engaging in a contrapuntal dialogue with the imperial projects of the empire. I also argue how on the one hand, Peer's memoir discursively articulates the territorial claim of India propagated through its new colonial policies, and on the other, problematizes the open question of Pakistan's role in the Kashmir issue, simultaneously engaging with an environmental ethic of the troubled land of Kashmir. Making use of Spivak's strategic essentialism, let me state my positionality right in the beginning of this paper. I position my critique from the standpoint of what Spivak states in her article, Attention Post-Colonialism. She says, and I quote, when the British Indian Empire was dissolved, for example, the subcontinent was divided. It was the part that is today called India that inherited the administrative structures from the empire, including the Indian Army. The other nation states, Pakistan, the subcolonial states of Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, do not therefore emerge in the same space in terms of old colonial history, unquote. Spivak's clear indication of India inheriting the administrative structures of the empire and her subsequent comment about the nation states of Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka not emerging with a similar baggage of colonial history as India is quite thought-provoking. In one aspect, it allows for understanding India as a possible beholder of empires and administrative traits, something discussed at a personal level by Peer in his memoir, and historians and many other historians and critics on historical and political level. Spivak's use of the phrase interpolated in diverse ways for herself, and her saying that she was excoriated with failed metalepsis because of her refusal to situate herself in a global migrancy is quite edifying. Speaking about herself and a Bangladeshi poet, Spivak is positioning herself in the marginalized space of a Bengali and not an Indian. Her article titled, therefore, is to exhort post-colonialism to be vigilant of any instance of trying to frame post-colonialism in a global frame. This is my positionality vis-a-vis to the discussions which are to follow in this paper, which addresses what Spivak calls as the failure of decolonization. In other words, Spivak is critical of the colonizing traits that India had adopted after the supposed resigning of the British Empire. In her article, she is talking in the context of exploitations of biodiversity, but I stretch it to all forms of marginalizations that are being meted out for the Kashmiri people, an extension which her article warrants. The recurring motif of this paper is ethnographic illustrations and absences, which are discussed in various contexts so that it can be the absences in our historical understandings, or absences in the meaning of erasure, or absences in comprehending the ramification of this Gaza strip of Kashmir, as the writer himself calls it, foregrounding historical importance of this perfectly peaceful place turning into one of the most heavily militarized zones in the world is helpful to figure out our absences or historical amnesia. Alistair Lamb's 3 books, which were a real eye-opener for me and correlate with many other independent critics of this issue, I'm going to restrict to some of the quotes from historical quotes. The first absence in this historical narrative is Lamb's statement about the Gilgit-Baltistan area, which clears the burgeoning contemporary myths surrounding these areas when he writes that, I quote, "The Gilgit region threw off all vestige of Dogra rule and declared for Pakistan," unquote. While for Jammu and Kashmir, Lamb writes about Kashmir's popular leader Sheikh Abdullah's devotion for Nehru because of both of their secular and Marxist leanings, which was in sharp contrast to Ahmed Jinnah's support for the revival of Muslim League under the leadership of Ghulam Abbas. However, Lamb also acknowledges Jinnah's principled stance for letting Kashmir settle its internal political strife, and so he and other leaders of Pakistan movement did not see the need and subsequently took no significant part in Kashmiri politics, unquote. Rakesh and Keith, in his latest book, has also quoted George Mullen, who writes for a majority of Khans and Muslim leagues as the most stable pro-British element in the country. And he also writes that India's spring offensive, expected in March 1948, which was looked upon in London as a fait accompli against Pakistan as well as UN. It is interesting to examine some political maneuvers to study these historical absences, which I'm going to just skip some of them and speak about some of them. Thus, it is seen that Maharaja avoids to meet with the Viceroy when Lord Mountbatten visits Kashmir. The Maharaja sends the Viceroy on a fishing trip, though he sends him on a fishing trip when he visits him. So though in a brief meeting that time that Maharaja affords the Viceroy, Mountbatten gives him a sound advice that he was not to join either the Constituent Assemblies until the Pakistan Constituent Assembly had been set up and the situation was a bit clearer. The Viceroy also advises the Maharaja to sign a standstill agreement with both India and Pakistan. Nehru disapproves of this visit and writes to the Viceroy, "There was a considerable disappointment at the lack of your results, the results of your visits," unquote. Lamb writes how there were forces against the very concept of Pakistan who believed in the inevitable collapse of this Islamic state, especially if the extending chaos at the time of partition was allowed to extend to Kashmir and its strategic borderlands. Thus, Lamb sees the allowing of an extension of the partition existing chaos to the borderland of Kashmir as an effective strategy employed by India. We then see the strategic moves of Acharya Kriplani, a leading figure of the Congress movement, visiting Kashmir prior to even partition. It is concomitant with the removal of a Hindu Prime Minister, Pandit Kak, on the suspicion of having some leaning towards Pakistan. Then Sheikh Abdullah is released from jail. These facts all point to the premeditated maneuvers by Indian establishment. Then we come across a secret correspondence of Sir Claude Echelney, commander of the Indian Army, over the crucial period of partition that he writes to his superiors in London. And I quote, "I have no hesitation whatever in affirming that present Indian cabinet are implacably determined to do all in their power to prevent the establishment of the Dominion of Pakistan on a firm basis. I'm supported by, I'm supported by the unanimous opinion of my senior officers and indeed by all responsible British officers cognizant of this situation," unquote. This quote, besides the obvious inference of Indian involvement in securing Kashmir with almost negligible ruse from Pakistan's side, reminds us of the Indian establishment inheriting the administrative structures of the empire that Spivak speaks of in an article when she's making post-colonialism aware of such pitfalls, which, to borrow Ashcroft words, may be called double colonization. Joseph Carville, who served on the United Nations Commission for India and Pakistan, has also traced the failed attempts of the UN Commission in his article dated as early as 1949. Kabul clearly indicates the interpellative stance of India when it does not allow the Security Council being in the role of a public administrator. However, Kabul commends Pakistan's principled stance, at least in this instance. Peer asked, Bashar Peer, the writer that I'm talking about, has the same question that were asked in Lamb's book, written only after 19 years of partition, that is 1966. Questions still valid after 71 years. The question was, what is to be the future of this region, where by a chapter of historical accidents, a Muslim majority entered the age of Asian independence under the leadership of a Hindu ruler? Lamb considers the Kashmir problem to be a British lapse, as he emphasizes on the need of the British to have ensured a workable representative governments. He clearly indicates that a popular Kashmir government could have made decisions about this future which both India and Pakistan would have respected, and thinks that an autocratic and unpopular Maharaja was hardly in a position to make decisions for the people of the land. In the light of the above discussion, it may be seen that when a text like Curfew Night is paletted as a life narrative by a writer in the 21st century, narrating almost similar lived-in concerns, it calls for a research. The historic and political absences help us to contextualize absences in our general understanding towards this phenomenon called Kashmir. Here I restrict myself to only 3 instances which provide a justification for subversive strategies in Kashmir for social justice and decolonization. Peer raises the question of environmental ethic for Islam when in his chapter titled Fragile Fairyland, he reminds his reader about the land which later metamorphoses into Curfew Night. Peer longs for the land where he and his younger brother Wajahad, after making snowmen, used to sneak out on the rooftop of their house and make homemade ice cream by the dipping broken icicles into a concoction of milk and sugar stolen from the kitchen. He longs for the simple joys of sliding down the slopes of the hills overlooking his neighborhood, or playing cricket on the frozen pond amidst the blushing snow. His description of his Kashmir reminds one of Hardy's imaginary pastoral heats of Essex, with Kashmir's, I quote, celebrating the flowers in the meadows and the nightingales in the willow branches, unquote, where there were always neighbors showing up for each other's help in the harvest season without any formal requests. In this agrarian society, where the educated rustics of Kashmir gathered around tangris, mobile firepots, to discuss the impact of untimely rainfall on the mustard crops, where if they, I again quote, saw streaks of scarlet in the sky, they said there has been a murder somewhere. When a man is killed, the sky turns red, unquote. And where on the cup of a kawa, the children are admonished for the silly pranks of stealing apples with the words, if they steal apples today, tomorrow they will rob a bank. These boys will grow up to be like Janak Singh, who had become a symbol of ultimate felony when he had killed a guard while robbing a bank and was sentenced for 14 years. Pierce says, and I quote, for nobody had killed a man in our area before or ever since, unquote. Or where the workers in the fields like Akram would always get a glass of milk and meat and chicken after the day's labor by Pierce's grandfather, and when Pierce's young mind naively asks the question, why enraged tourists travel so much? He works it out himself that they had to travel to Kashmir to see Kashmir, while his young heart swells with pride to be living where those tourists throng to visit its beauty. Coming to the next phase of his life, Pierce sketches an insider's account of a 13-year-old child witnessing the Gokadal Bridge massacre in 1990. Gokadal massacre reminds us of many similar massacres, one being in Jallianwala Bagh massacre in 1919, one of the darkest chapters of colonial history. But can we really make a comparison? They did not butcher the already dying and wailing human beings the way they did on Gokadal Bridge. Narrating only about one survivor of Gokadal massacre, Farooq, Peer writes that he was pretending to be dead and waiting for the soldiers to leave. However, a kangri, a burning coal, was burning his cheek, and he turns his face to avoid the burn. Peer says, and I quote, the murdering officers saw him. This bastard is alive. Farooq heard him shout. The officer ran towards him, kicked him, and a volley of bullets pierced his body. He lost consciousness. Unquote. It is a sheer miracle that Farooq remains alive and is able to narrate his erasure to Peer. Therefore, Gokadal massacre, a watershed in Kashmir's history, with the soldiers firing bullets into any stirring body of unarmed civilians on the Governor Jagmohan's orders to crush the incipient rebellion, and the rebellion was nothing else but the unarmed civilians raising their voice against incarcerations of innocent Kashmiris, reminds one of Spivak's words of India inheriting the administrative structures of the empire. For a Kashmiri identity, any amelioration in these neo-colonial administrative structures is not seen a possibility so far, especially when it is still an ongoing phenomenon till the close of the second decade of this millennium. Another writer, Makash, a Kashmiri rap artist, narrates about a 2010 incident in which a 15-year-old boy, Inayat, who happens to be only a bystander when the Central Reserve Police Force opens fire on unarmed crowds again, gets injured in the thigh. Lying on the road, the child is crying out for help, and I quote, "A CRPF gypsy came speeding by and ran over his helpless body. If this wasn't enough, the Indian troopers got down from the gypsy and stomped on Inayat till he lay dead," unquote. His mother and other women of the neighborhood have to walk down to the posh residence of Umar Abdullah to even get the child's body retrieved from the police. Peer and Mekash and several other writers seem to be questioning these heroin-walking traits of Indian administrative structures in which young children, as young as 8-year-olds, are murdered on mass scale. Only 2 atrocities out of thousands happening after a gap of 20 years may point out at the need to study the post-colonial environmental ethic in the context of Kashmir. The first is an episode that Arundhati Roy quotes in her book, writes in her book. She says, while on her way to meet with the widower, Shakib Ahmed Ahangar, in the Shopian district, Roy juxtaposes the apple-picking season of, I quote, families in their orchards busily packing apples into wooden crates in the slanting afternoon light with her meeting with she juxtaposes this scene with her meeting with the living dead of a husband with a small son, mourning the loss of his young wife and sister raped and murdered in 2009. The gruesome images of bodies of his 22-year-old wife, Nilofer, and his 17-year-old sister, Asya, lying in a shallow stream, and I quote, in a highly security zone, a floodlit area between army and state police camps, unquote, become further unbearable when Roy describes the ugly business of exhuming the bodies after the authorities plan on changing the first autopsy report of rape and murder to just death by drowning. Roy is reporting about these crimes happening after 2 decades, that is in 2009, exactly in the same manner when 20 years ago, more than 20 women were raped in 1990 by the Indian Army in the adjoining district of Kunan Poshpura, which Basharat Peer also writes in his memoir, but he also writes that his courage fails him to visit this mutilated city. Roy's evocative description of an illogical, corrupt, and wholly unjust world, as Parker calls it, in which nothing changes with the passing years except for the worse, calls for the need of studying the environment of apple orchards against the social injustices borne by the people of this land of Kashmir, where when the former top Indian military official is asked by a student, why soldiers rape women, and when the ex-director general's response is that they have needs too, it calls for a research into a clash between the contemporary conservationist aims of ostensibly crushing the armed militancy and rights of local indigenous peoples, as Hagan asserts. It is also what Amy Cesar has often offered as an equation. Colonization is equal to thingification. These manifestations of mindless murders, akin to naturalizing human beings as things and to be used or misused for their own gains, is the thingification of the people and identity of Kashmir. I will stop here with these concluding words for now, for further analysis in this ongoing study, that Pierce seems to be raising questions of social justice when he says, and I quote, Prague had protested and won. Berlin had protested and won. Kashmir too had believed that their protests would win Kashmir its freedom. Unquote. He expresses the frustrations of the early 90s, calling it a naive, heady time. But Kashmiri demonstrations fade after the massacres, he says. He observes that the conflict would not have become so bloody, I quote again, if India had allowed those peaceful demonstrations. Firing on protesters, arrests, disappearances, custodial killings, kidnappings, assassinations, and torture dominated Kashmir, unquote, with the added Orientalism factor of miming the innocent civilians as militants and criminals. I thank you.